Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. It's still morning, just before 12 o'clock. We're going to talk about the role of AI-generated content in machine learning today and beyond 2026. But before we get started, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Eric. I'm working as an executive advisor, which means I'm a consultant for product business and agile software development. Been in the industry now for around 15 years, mainly in product management roles. I successfully founded a startup. I'm a tech enthusiast. What does that mean? I'm one of the guys that also, since his childhood, played around with hardware a lot and manipulated files like config.sys and AutoExec in order to get Doom up and running on my 386 SX25. So I'm into hardware a lot. I'm not a programmer. I'm more into the product part, as I already mentioned. And I'm always interested in new developments and new technologies, such as AI, but also crypto and Web3 technologies, and play around a lot with them. So I was also one of the guys who tried to get one of the smaller models up and running on my home hardware. And today I brought to you 3 chapters related to the topic. We will start with the role of regulation, and then we hop over to ethics and bias in AI. And then we will have a look at synthetic versus real-world data. And in the end, we're going to sum things up to see what we've learned so far. So let's kick off with the role of regulations. Why do we have to start there if we talk about content? Because we have to know where we're going and where we are at, and what are the parameters that we have to have a look on. So the first thing we have to start, if we talk about content, if you like it or not, is GDPR. Well, overall, I might not have to say a lot about it because everybody knows it. It's about the storage of data, processing of data, collection of data, deletion of data. And it's also about data minimization, data portability. And there are some concepts related like privacy by default or privacy by design, which we have to keep in mind when we develop our software. And there are also some technical and organizational measures we have to take in terms of GDPR in order to ensure that the data is safe. So everything should be clear. But if we have a deeper look, I mean, the GDPR was announced in 2016. In 2018, it became mandatory. And now we are at 2023. So everything is fine, you should say. But if we look at the details, and this is an actual statistic from Statista, 88% say that the implementation of the GDPR never was fully completed. And 78% say that they have legal uncertainties ranging around the GDPR requirements. So let me translate that for you. That this means that around 88% haven't even really started or finished what they've done with the GDPR, and 78% are not even sure what they have to do and which laws apply to them. So if you take one thing from this talk, looking into the future, because we are here at 2023 at the end nearly, you must hurry to apply to the GDPR. And why that is so, we will get to in the next slide, because the EU AI Act is just around the corner. And why is this important and why I'm talking about the GDPR? Because in my opinion, the GDPR, also the EU AI Act, is not directly related to the GDPR. So if you have to handle anything with data, then it's the GDPR. But in the EU AI Act just handles the risk. But in my opinion, it's a layer that you have to ensure, because the GDPR handles how the data is stored and processed, but the EU AI Act handles what AI may do with this data and what risks are implied also related to the data you put in. And as most of you know, there's currently a huge debate going on what should be regulated and what not. Just recently, Germany, Italy, and France suggested that we leave out the models, the basic models, the foundation models out of the EU AI Act, and suggested model cards. What does this mean? This means that you describe what your model does, what it can and can't do, but you leave it aside from the regulation. You just regulate the applications of your products. So most people don't know what the EU AI Act is all about. It's about risk. It's a risk assessment, not only of large language models, like you could think, it's about the whole system. So it's not just regulating your large language model, it's regulating your whole chain, supply chain, till the production of your product. So you have to ensure that everything in your production chain, if you release a product or a web service using AI technologies, is safe. There are 4 categories that AI is ranked in by the EU AI Act. So minimal risk, you already know that. It's some sort of code of conduct for spam filters and fraud detection. It's the same we apply to already every day. And the next category are the limited risks, where you have transparency obligations. It's the same as with the GDPR. So you have to ensure that the user of your product or service knows what technologies you use, how the data is being used, and how the model or how the product itself works connected to AI. There's some sorts like chatbots, etc. And it really gets tricky in the upper part, so with the high risks and the unacceptable risks. I mean, unacceptable risks, for example, is something like social scoring or facial recognition and manipulation, which is banned. The hard part is staying in the limited or low risk, because if you apply to the high risks, you have conformity assessments that you have to deal with as a company or as a startup, which means that you will be registered in the EU with your solution. You have to continuously monitor your solution and its application on the user side as well. I don't know how that's done, but that's part of the regulation. And it's part of the debate that's going on currently. And that's why so many companies currently don't agree if the EU AI Act should be put in place by this way. But nevertheless, in 2026, that's about the timeline we will have the EU AI Act if they can agree in the EU. So they have to agree till the end of the year. Otherwise, because there's another legislation period, we have to start over again, maybe, and it will take longer till it's in place. The next thing you have to have a look on, if you're talking about content, is the use of existing laws, AI-specific laws, and also laws that prohibit the usage of the technology. So it gets even more complicated. I recently saw a list from Tobias Haar, which is legal counsel at Aleph Alpha, which laws you have to apply to and what you all have to keep in mind if you develop a product. It's pretty much, and it's in our responsibility to keep track of that and to ensure that, like I mentioned, the whole value chain of the products you use and the services applies to the laws. And the next thing that becomes important is intellectual property, because all the content that we're creating, is it text or images or videos, implies to intellectual property. So you have on the one side the copyrights for scientific and literacy, you have musical works, you have works of art and audiovisual works, and the adoption and collected works. And on the other hand, you have the property rights with trademarks, etc. And all these are influenced by AI, but none of them seriously is solved. So the first thing that has to happen in law, and this is why the debate is ranging around this, is that we adopt the existing laws to using AI instead of just regulating the stuff with a new EU AI Act. And it's our responsibility. That's the case anyway. So we as developers, product managers have to deal with it over the next years. And if you take one thing then that you learn today, then you should get a data privacy officer that helps you with the GDPR stuff, because that's the basis for everything. And then you should have a deeper look on how you can apply to the other parts of the law. So now we're getting more into the content part of this talk. The second part is about the ethics and bias. So why do we have to talk now? I mean, there's 3 things that are important if we're talking about content generation. So the first thing is bias in the models that we currently have. The second one is the lack of human-generated data that we have. And the third one is the flaws that we have in the models. So let me give you an example of bias in AI models. This is a very easy example that you can do, and I did it 2 days ago with, you can pick any nationality you want. This was a group of Chinese, and you get just a bunch of figures of statues. If you do that for Germans, you just get a bunch of Nazis, and that's always the case. If you use Midjourney, they haven't fixed it for around a year now, but you can easily see how biased these models are. And one thing that I learned, or I recognized over the last few weeks and months, I tried this with text generating models as well. So just describe a group of Germans or a group of Chinese, and you get a more differentiated answer out of the text-based models. But if you use the image generating models, then you get a lot of bias. And this is a really huge problem that we're going to face over the next year. Why is that so? Because some reports state that we are running out of human-generated data by 2026. There is a study by the Europol that suggests that around 90% of the content that will be generated over the next years will come from AI, or at least with the help of AI. And we have to have a look on what's the impact on that, and what's the impact for us in terms of data selection and model training. Then there's the limitations of the models. So even if you use high quality data for your training, like the example with Galactica, which was last year in 2022, it was only available, I guess it was around 3 days, and then it was taken down because it just produced a lot of trash. So even if you have high quality data, you cannot ensure that the model produces content that is relevant and that is true, because the models hallucinate. I mean, that's the basic thing about that. It's a black box that generates content. That's the one part, and it hallucinates, and you cannot ensure what kind of data it produces. And then users were asked, how likely do they think that tools like ChatGPT produce false information and false content on topics in the news? I mean, we see this lately very dramatically in the war, especially in Israel, that there is very much fake content generated. And as the studies show, most of the people think it is very likely, and it is, that there is fake content. Why this is an issue and what kind of role this plays, we will see in just 2 slides more. So this is another study I found of the AI capabilities to generate deepfake audio and video content. This also is true for text-based content. So everybody sees the risk very high that the content is generated has some sort of deepfake in it. And so why is this important? Because on the one hand, it becomes easier and easier to generate this sort of content. And for humans, it becomes harder and harder to distinguish the content, if it is real or not. And if what I say is true and holds up, so that till 2026, 90% of the content that is generated comes from AI, then this is becoming an avalanche over the next years, because the models we use to generate this content right now is so biased that a large amount of the data, if we use the data that is generated now by users, will become a problem for us in the future in our data sets. So if we start this avalanche, you create some sort of fake content, a human picks this up, maybe writes another article about it, somebody is tweeting about the article, the tweet is used in Grok to train the model, then a human picks this tweet and creates another part of the content with the help of AI, and you can endlessly continue this chain, and the ball gets even bigger and bigger over the next few years. So we have to deal with the situation now, and we have to think about which ways can we go to create content that is true, that is reliable, that is unbiased. And one thing that I learned just recently, it was from a talk from Lera Boroditsky, which is a professor in language. And she was showing an example like here. So it is different which kind of language you use for your training data. Most of the training data nowadays is English. But how big is the impact of different languages in our training data? For example, in German, the word sun is feminine, and in Spanish, it's masculine. And for the moon, it's the other way around. And the example that she gave was, if you ask a Spanish speaking to describe a bridge, and it's a male word, he will describe it with male adjectives mainly. So it's long, it's big. While the Germans describe it more like with adjectives like beautiful. So what this implies is that language itself has more patterns in it that models need to understand, and that we have to have in our data sets in order to produce content that is not only for English-speaking people relevant, but also in other languages. So even if the models are able to translate the content, this doesn't mean that they understand the patterns that these languages include. Let me give you another example. So she showed a picture in her talk, which is on TED, where a man broke a vase in a museum. And if you would describe the situation in English, you would say, he broke the vase accidentally. And in Spanish, you might say something more like, the vase was broken by accident. So what this does is, while in English, you're pointing to the one who destroyed the vase, in Spanish, you focus more on what happened in the situation. And this makes a huge difference for us if we train our models and if we think about how the content in models is generated. Because what we see in practice are just the tips of the iceberg. We have to find ways to understand the patterns integrated in language, integrated in our culture, integrated into the different languages to ensure that the models really provide an unbiased and ethically correct output. In practice, I see two main use cases that many companies are currently dealing with or thinking about in order to produce content. I call it, the one part is the agent part, so everything you do now with GPTs, for example. And the second part are the archivists. So the agents that I mean is everything you produce from content side in related to marketing, for example. So everything that you use to communicate with users outside your company, while many companies like Bosch, for example, or DM introduce their own GPT models like Bosch GPT or DM GPT, which more make the knowledge inside the companies accessible. So if you think about bias, you have to differentiate if you use a model more like sort of an archivist or more like an agent. Why is that so? Because the bias is different if you just have your internal data to ensure that everybody can access your knowledge, you don't know how biased this data is. For example, you just develop products for a specific target group and now want to innovate and develop products for another target group. But how do you get good suggestions out of a model that is trained on basically the data that is just related for one target group? So we have to find out more mechanisms. And one thing I find still irritating is the only way that content is rated currently, or the main way that content is rated currently with these models, is by thumbs up or thumbs down, or maybe it's okay what the AI did. But we have to find other solutions to find out if the content that is produced is really good, is unbiased, is really correct, instead of just saying yes or no. It doesn't apply and it doesn't work in practice. So now let's hop into the third chapter and the last part of this presentation, where we're going to talk about synthetic and real-world data and how you can use this to maybe solve some sort of the problem, or at least parts of it. So if we're talking about AI-generated content, there are 3 different types of content generation. It's professional teams generating or people generating content, users generating content by using a creative platform, and AI-generated content is the combination. That's basically what this slide is saying. And if we're now trying to develop models, then most of you might know that you will take 3 steps. So the first step is collecting explanatory data to train a supervised strategy. And the second part is collecting comparative data to train a reward model. And in the third part, collecting even more explanatory data to optimize the model. One important trend that I currently see that is interesting is, on the one hand, you are getting even more bigger and bigger models like GPT-4 and its predecessors. And on the other hand, the tendency is getting more and more to smaller models like Llama with around 13 billion parameters or 7 billion parameters. And one good example that also smaller models can provide good outputs is Orca 2, which was released a few days or weeks ago, I guess, which is based on Llama 2. It's a model that has also a 7 billion parameter and a 13 billion parameter version, and is really producing good outputs that are good for our product use cases. So specifically, if you want to use models and run models, you don't want to deploy those large-scale models, maybe you use smaller models. This is also a trend that was picked up by Gartner. So Gartner just recently released a study that around 75% of the companies will move from big data to small data and to wider data. What this means is, just instead of just pumping a large amount of data in your models and in your product use cases, maybe it might be a good idea to focus more on high quality data. And the role of synthetic data, I will also mention in a few slides. So Orca was successful because, that's what Microsoft stated, it used carefully filtered synthetic data for the post-training phase. And Orca's success also lies in the application of diverse reasoning techniques. So also the things that I mentioned, how do you reason with a language or with a model? These techniques are currently mainly used by users on the prompting side. So you prompt stuff in a single shot and ask questions, and then you start, if the results don't are not good enough, you start with chain of thought, and if that doesn't help, then you start with tree of thought, so you get more quality answers and you can rate those answers. And what we see more and more by the content generation is that more and more models especially like Orca 2 is getting into using step-by-step processes in their models as well, so that you don't have to prompt it afterwards in order to get the results. So the model itself is able to do so, and this makes the model also smaller. There are some things that we haven't touched yet. So stuff like, okay, if you develop a model, what does this do to our environment? I mean, the amount of energy needed to train a large language model is becoming bigger and bigger. And we also have to think about what we can do to make this environmentally friendly. And one of the solutions is, like I just mentioned, maybe you can use specifically for your use cases or products, you can use one of the smaller models that you can run on the hardware, which is also trained on smaller amounts of data sets and does use less energy. So the discussion in the next few months and weeks will more and more range around. This is also one takeaway about the environmental friendliness of models. I guess that this discussion will heat up in the next year. Open source plays a critical role, like I just mentioned, models like Orca or Llama that have been used over the last month. And some of the developments to make those models even smaller come from the open source community. And that's why I do recommend that we keep open source a part of the game. There are also the bigger companies like OpenAI that try to limit open source software development with models, but I think it is crucial for us to have open source development for the upcoming models. And one thing that is also important, if you want to apply to the laws and you want to ensure that your model is safe or your product use case is safe, you have to come up with some sort of poisoning prevention. So prompt injection and poisoning protection is crucial. So how can we make AI content better? So here are 3 examples how you can do that. For example, like a digital twin. You could use digital twins for objects, but you can also use digital twins, like, for example, simulating a situation. How does a user with a specific background react to such sort of content? So it's not about only testing if the results are valuable or true. You can also use digital twins in order to ensure that no human is offended by the text or by the image that is generated. So digital twins is a good way to ensure that AI-generated content is becoming more and more ethically correct, if you put it that way. Intelligent editing and intelligent creation also become more and more important. And accessibility is also a topic. So, for example, we designed a small product which is called Luther at Meondi that takes the texts and optimizes them to be more accessible for all sorts of people. I can share the link later so you can try it out if you want. But you have to really ensure that you use some sort of technology to check if your content is ethically going in the right direction. And some of the ways are here. And especially regarding the language, you can use more languages and more cultural patterns to do so. We need to enhance these systems now because we produce the quality we produce the content and the quality of the content now that is used in 2 or 3 years when most content is generated by AI. So another thing that I suggest how you can basically put stuff together is in the GDPR, you have this concept of privacy by design. So my suggestion would be that you do something more like ethics by design. So if you develop a product nowadays, it's not about the features. You have to think about the core beliefs that you touch. If your solution becomes more personalized and people use personalized products, you have to implement ethics by design in your models. And there are a lot of ways you can do that. For example, deduplication of content. If you have too much of a data set with similar content, and two other things will become more and more important for the users as well as you when you develop those things. It's explainability, so that AI itself explains why it came to this conclusion, and interpretability, so that the user understands what is done. There was just last year, I guess, a paper on archive from Aleph Alpha with ATMAN, so attention management, which is a technology where you can focus the AI's attention on specific parameters or at specific patterns that need to be recognized. Those are all good solutions that you can keep in mind if you develop the content. And two things that are becoming more and more important with the EU AI Act is monitoring and protection, because this is what we have to ensure in order to develop product solutions that use some sort of AI. So we need to come up with monitoring solutions and protection solutions, especially like I mentioned, with prompt injection and poisoning of models, which is becoming a larger problem nowadays. So the first thing here, if you take something away from this slide, is start with ethics and not with filters. Because what currently happens is that the bigger models just filter stuff away. So telling the model afterwards, you shouldn't say that, focus more on that and say something like that. That is not the way you should design your models, and this is not the way that content should be created. You have to start with ethics first, and then, if it doesn't work, apply filters. So let us jump in to another main topic. So it's real world data versus synthetic data. What are the pros and cons? So sure, if you use real world data, you have authenticity, you have variability, and you have relevance on the one side. But on the contra side, you have these privacy concerns that we just mentioned earlier. You have the biases in the language itself and in the amount of content that you have. And you have the labeling challenges. So labeling the data is pain in the ass. With this amount of data you're using to train your models, you have to label the whole data set. Is very, very difficult. While if you use synthetic data, you can automate the labeling process with the content that you generate. So for synthetic data is speaking, they are, if the data is correct, it's privacy safe, so you're not harming anything, and it's quite easy to apply to the GDPR, and there are a lot of good data sets out there to use for training. It is more customizable, so you get the data you want, and like with the example that I've mentioned from Orca, that's exactly what they did. They defined a data set with synthetic data in order to produce better outputs of the model. So if you're building something, an internal or an external solution, and you're having to decide whether or not to use synthetic data, my argument would be try to find good sources for synthetic data, because this will help you a lot. But also think about the other part with using different languages and not only English, in order to train the models with different language patterns and patterns that are rooted in the culture that provides or that produced the language. So now let us have a look at the future of AI-generated content. So for me, it's, like I said, basically starting with ethics by design. So you need to implement ethics strategies. You need to focus on attention management in your model, diversify your training set, and update existing laws is something that is necessary for us. I'm not sure how fast this will happen. I guess rather later than earlier. So we have to deal with that. But you have to always keep track of what is currently the state of the law. We have to introduce fairness metrics, like equality in our data sets. This is what meant with EOD. We need regulatory frameworks, but I don't think that the EU AI Act is the way to go. That's an opinion. Transparency and explainability will become more and more important. So when you generate content for the user, please try to find ways to explain to the user how and why the content is generated, or at least use sources. Some models include sources why and how the content was generated, so that you at least can identify, okay, this was generated because it was referencing on a paper that was found somewhere. And last but not least, educate your users on the content. So time's almost up, got 10 minutes left. Time for a sum up. So if you take 4 things away, then it's start your GDPR homework right now. Include data privacy officers in your product solutions, because it will become necessary if you want to work with AI. If you have this foundation straight, it will be much easier for you to deal with the EU AI Act and everything that is related to AI. Start now. So it's not, okay, let's wait for a year or 2. You have to start now to implement stuff, because like I already mentioned, if a lot of the content and a lot of the data sets that we use is generated by AI, we need to act now. And the 4th thing is utilize language and diversify your data. Use synthetic data to enrich your models, and also use different languages, like I mentioned. And then let's find metrics and bias detection mechanisms to ensure that the data that we create is human-friendly. And one last statement is make ethics really a core building block of your products. So the last slide is about what we did. So, I mean, it's pretty basic for what we did with Luther, so our tool. So locate your server in the EU to be GDPR conform, conclude the data protection contracts, involve data protection experts, and look at your own conditions and really provide as much information as you can for the user, so that your user is safe and ensured what is happening with his data and with his by the use with your product. That's it from me. So up to you now. I'm happy to discuss what was just shown. Any questions, impulses from your side? Yep, thank you.
Thank you. One question about human-generated content. You stated there's 2026. Everything will be part of the AI. What about this great amount of content which is part of the intranet of a company? Is this already included, or only the open data?
It's everything that's being used, because on the one hand, the data has been used to train the models, and on the other hand, it's about the data that is currently generated.
Okay, everything's included.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the talk in the first place. I have a bit of a question, because you talked a lot about the language dependency on the training data. And in my opinion, it would actually be good to have a neutral language. And as you said, like you compared German and Spanish at one point, where the genders of some words are different. And English, for example, has the advantage that it doesn't have genders in words usually, I think. And I wanted just to know your thoughts on, do you think like a universal neutral language would make this kind of better, to translate everything into some neutral language? I just recently learned of the concept that it might be better to train like these language models using some neutral language, which we might not have actually, but English is probably the closest thing we have. And I just wanted to know your thoughts on that, if you have any.
Yeah, it's quite difficult. I think that doesn't solve the underlying issue with some sorts of information that is buried in languages is getting lost. One example that Lera Boroditsky provided, for example, was Aborigines use a different way to orientate in the wild. So they have no word for left or right. They use north, south, and east for everything. So how is it going? They're going to say, it's very good, going southeast. Or my southeast toe is hurting. So these concepts are hidden in language and are getting lost if we just condense it to one specific overall language that tries to leverage, or not leverage, nivellate those differences in languages. We lose a bit of cultural aspects that are connected with language. So I don't think that would be my suggestion, that just condensing it to one language would help.
Yeah. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah, I had a question regarding one risk you mentioned about all this data that's generated and then that's out on the web and that might be reused to train model. And you mentioned that, for example, you might have some biases that are amplified. Another effect that I've heard of, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it, is that also you have an issue with quality. So you cannot just have a language model, train data, then train a new model on this generated data. And if there were like some papers on this, that if you do this too much, then in the end you just have noise or garbage. So what are the kind of things we could do to tackle this issue, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, one part of the solution I already mentioned was synthetic data. So you have to ensure that the data has a specific amount of quality and you produce what outputs you generate. So you can generate any amount of data that is necessary to train new models with synthetic data. But in order to do so, you need to find quality mechanisms first to identify, okay, is this the data that can be used? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's
okay.
So you talked about ethics by design principle. So can you also tell us about any framework that you use, like before starting the training? Do you have a set of framework to consider ethics and put it into place?
No, currently we don't have any framework. It's just like by using the products, we try to identify if content is more harmful, but currently we don't have a solution for that, or a training set, or a specific set of tests that we use. We're also at the beginning at the moment and starting to evaluate how can we apply different metrics and different sorts of ethical frameworks. So one metric could be to ensure that no matter if, for example, in the employer processes where you analyze if someone can be promoted, for example, and you use AI to make these decisions, then you have to ensure that the output is not related to gender or to age or to specific nationality. So you can test that, but other ways than testing I haven't found so far. There are no frameworks, and that is why we need to develop them now. No.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a question regarding, so I work in trust and safety, essentially, let's say fraud detection. Up to what point we need to be transparent about our models and not tell fraudulent actors how we are detecting them? You know, it's a little bit of, mouse and cat game. If we tell them how we're doing it, probably they'll change, and then we tell them again how we're doing it. So how do you balance that of being transparent, but still not being so open that essentially they know how to cheat the system? Yeah,
I mean, in terms of the regulation, you might be in the low-level risk scenario with fraud detection, so you don't have to apply and explain everything that you do. That would be the best case. So my suggestion would be try to be at a low level and do not use specifically AI solutions in your value chain in order to do fraud detection, or at least the part that is core to your business, try to do it without AI solutions, or at least try to stay above the threshold with low and limited risks. That's the only solution currently. Yeah, it's 12:30, so thank you very much for your time. If you have any further questions, then I'm happy to answer. Thank you.